The morning Gail Fenwick knocked on my door at 7:15 in the freezing cold, clipboard in hand, and a smile that could curdle milk. I knew it was going to be one of those days. Not just a regular bad day, either. One of those days where you look back weeks later and realize it was actually the beginning of something much bigger than a petty neighborhood dispute. One of those days that ends with lawyers, a county sheriff, a packed HOA meeting, and one very red-faced middle-aged woman trying to explain herself to a roomful of people who were no longer buying whatever she was selling. But let me back up and give you the full picture, because this story is worth telling properly. It was the third week of January, and the entire Northeast had been getting absolutely hammered by winter. Not the gentle, photogenic kind of winter where snowflakes drift peacefully onto pine branches while somebody sips hot cocoa by a window. No. This was the brutal, aggressive, makes you question every life choice kind of winter. We had already seen 2 major snowstorms that month, and the meteorologists were cheerfully predicting a third one coming in from Canada by the weekend. Roads were iced over by 5 in the morning. Driveways were a full-time job. My back already ached from 3 separate shoveling sessions, and my neighbor down the street, old Pete Gallagher, had sprained his wrist trying to clear his walkway after the second storm rolled through. The neighborhood I live in is called Creekside Pines, which sounds lovely and serene, but is in reality a subdivision of about 90 homes crammed reasonably close together, with a set of HOA rules that had been steadily expanding since the original developer handed control over to the elected board. And at the center of that board, orbiting everything like a small but aggressively territorial planet, was Gail Fenwick. Gail had been on the HOA board for 6 years. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, always impeccably dressed even when she was tromping through snow in your front yard, and she operated with the kind of self-righteous certainty that only comes from spending too much time in positions of petty authority. She had a talent for finding violations that nobody else could see, citing rules that were either buried in footnotes or that she had personally lobbied to add to the bylaws over time. She had fined people for Christmas lights that were 1 inch too low on the roofline. She had issued a warning to a couple on Birchwood Drive because their welcome mat was, in her words, not consistent with the aesthetic standards of the community. She had tried, unsuccessfully, to block a family from painting their shutters dark green because she felt it conflicted with the neighborhood's color palette, a concept she had personally invented and attempted to codify with no actual board vote. She was a piece of work, and everyone on the street knew it, but she had enough of a grip on 2 other board members that she usually got her way, at least in the short term. I had managed to mostly stay off her radar for the 4 years I had lived in Creekside Pines. I kept my lawn neat, my house maintained, my garbage bins put away promptly. I paid my HOA dues on time. I was not a troublemaker by nature. I am Larry Baker, 51 years old, recently divorced, work from home as a software consultant, and I genuinely just wanted to live my life without drama. Drama, unfortunately, had other plans. The whole thing started because of the ice storm. About 10 days before Gail knocked on my door, we had gotten hit with a particularly nasty ice storm followed immediately by a heavy snow. The power went out from my side of the street at around 6 in the evening, right in the middle of January, with temperatures dropping toward single digits overnight. The utility company estimated restoration in 12 to 18 hours, which is a very polite way of saying they had no idea but wanted to sound optimistic. Now, I had been a homeowner for a long time, and I had learned some lessons the hard way. One of those lessons was that you do not want to be caught in a winter power outage without a backup plan. A few years earlier, during a different outage, I had lost nearly everything in my refrigerator and freezer, gone 2 days without heat, and spent an uncomfortable night in 4 layers of clothing wondering if my pipes were going to freeze. After that experience, I invested in a portable diesel generator. Not a tiny little camping generator either. A solid mid-sized unit, capable of running my furnace, my refrigerator, a few lights, and whatever else I needed to keep the house functional through an outage. That generator had already saved me twice since I bought it. This was the third time. So when the power went out that January evening, I pulled the generator out of my garage, set it up in the driveway following all the proper safety guidelines about keeping it away from windows and doors, ran my extension cords, got everything connected, and that generator hummed to life beautifully. My furnace kicked on. My refrigerator stayed cold. I had lights. I was warm. My neighbor Gary Mossner from 2 houses down came over looking genuinely miserable because he had no backup power, so I let him run an extension cord over and at least keep his refrigerator going. His wife Denise nearly hugged me. Even old Pete Gallagher shuffled over in his enormous parka asking if he could charge his phone and medical monitoring device, and of course I said yes. The power was out for almost 19 hours, by the way. So much for 12 to 18. During that time, the generator needed to be refueled. This is not a complicated process. You shut the generator off for a few minutes to let it cool. You pour diesel fuel from a properly stored and approved fuel container into the tank. You restart it. I had stored fuel in a proper carb-compliant diesel container in my garage, the right way, by the book. I refueled the generator in my driveway. Twice. Over the course of those 19 hours, because that is what you do when you are running a generator through a long outage. I did not think twice about it. I was in my own driveway. I was following every safety protocol. The generator was off during refueling. No spills, no drama, just a practical person managing a practical situation during a winter emergency. Power came back. Life returned to normal, or so I thought. Because 3 days later there was Gail Fenwick on my doorstep at 7:15 in the morning, clipboard in hand, her breath making little clouds in the freezing air, wearing a bright teal wool coat like she was heading to some kind of neighborhood inspection gala. I opened the door in my sweatpants and a flannel shirt, coffee in hand, squinting at her. "Good morning, Larry," she said, in that tone that is technically pleasant but carries an unmistakable undertone of "I have caught you doing something wrong." "Morning, Gail," I said. "It's below 20 out here. What's going on?" She held up her clipboard. "I'm here because I received a report that you were refueling a portable diesel generator in your driveway during the recent power outage." I stared at her for a second. "Yes," I said slowly, "I was. The power was out for 19 hours in January. I was keeping my heat running." "I understand," she said, in a way that made clear she absolutely did not care. "However, the refueling of portable generators in residential driveways is prohibited under Section 14, subsection C of the Creekside Pines HOA Community Standards and Guidelines." I actually laughed. Not in a mean way, just in the way you laugh when something is so surprising and absurd that your brain processes it as comedy before it processes it as a problem. "Are you serious right now?" She tilted her clipboard slightly. "I'm always serious about community standards, Larry. The refueling of combustion-powered equipment using flammable or combustible liquids in driveways, which are common visibility areas under the community aesthetic standards, is prohibited. I am issuing you a formal written notice today and informing you that a second offense will result in a fine of $250. She handed me a printed notice, actual printed paperwork, with my name on it, the alleged violation, the section number, the date, and a signature line where she had signed as HOA board secretary. I stood there holding this piece of paper in the cold, blinking at it, trying to process the timeline of events. A major winter storm, a 19-hour power outage in single-digit temperatures, a generator that kept a 51-year-old man's heat on and also helped 2 neighbors. And here was Gail Fenwick at dawn in teal wool, issuing me a formal violation notice for refueling that generator in my own driveway. "Gail," I said, keeping my voice even, You understand there was a power emergency. There was no other place to safely refuel it. You can't run a diesel generator inside a garage. That's not my concern, she said briskly. Community standards apply regardless of circumstances unless a formal emergency exemption has been applied for in advance. In advance, I repeated. You want me to apply for an emergency exemption in advance, before the emergency happens. The process is in the bylaws, she said pleasantly, and turned on her heel and walked back down my driveway through the snow, picking her way carefully around an icy patch near the bottom. I stood in my doorway in the cold, holding the violation notice, watching her go, and thought to myself, okay then. If this is how we're playing it, then we are going to play it properly. I went inside, poured more coffee, sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop, and pulled up every single HOA document I had ever been given. The original purchase disclosure packet, the CC and RS, the bylaws, the community standards and guidelines, every amendment ever distributed. I had all of it saved as PDFs because I am that kind of person, the kind who actually reads and files the paperwork, which is genuinely rare, and is also the reason I was about to have a very good time with this situation. Section 14, subsection C, I found it. I read it 3 times. Then I sat back in my chair and actually smiled, because Section 14, subsection C did not say what Gail Fenwick said it said. What it actually said was that homeowners were prohibited from the operation of commercial fuel transfer equipment, including external fuel pump assemblies or mobile fuel delivery vehicles, in residential driveways, without prior board approval. The language was specifically about commercial fuel transfer equipment, fuel pump assemblies, mobile fuel delivery vehicles. It was written to prevent someone from, say, parking a commercial fuel truck in their driveway and operating it as a business, or setting up some kind of fueling station. It was not written to prohibit a homeowner from pouring diesel from a legal fuel container into their personal generator on their own property. The section also included a paragraph that Gail had clearly not mentioned, which stated that emergency circumstances involving utility service interruptions were expressly considered reasonable grounds for temporary operational exceptions for residential equipment, provided that all applicable safety codes were followed. There it was. Right there in the actual bylaws, an emergency exception clause, and I had been operating a residential piece of equipment, not commercial fuel transfer equipment, while following all applicable safety codes. I had not violated Section 14, subsection C, not even close. I took photos of the relevant pages on my laptop screen. I highlighted the text. I wrote up a brief but detailed written response to the violation notice, citing the exact language of the bylaw, explaining why my actions did not fall within the prohibited conduct, and invoking the emergency exception clause. I also noted, very calmly and politely, that misrepresenting the content of community bylaws in a formal violation, notice issued to a homeowner, could constitute a procedural violation by the board member issuing the notice, and that I reserved all rights to present this matter at the next community meeting. I sent it via email to the entire HOA board, all 5 members, with a red receipt request. I printed a hard copy and hand-delivered it to the HOA management company's drop box that afternoon, documented with a photo of me placing it in the box and a timestamp. Then I waited to see what Gail Fenwick would do next. What she did next was not what I expected. I figured she would back down, or at least go quiet for a while. Instead, she escalated. 3 days later, I received a second notice, this one claiming that the generator itself had been stored improperly in my driveway and constituted an eyesore in violation of community aesthetic standards. The generator had been in my driveway for exactly 22 hours during the power outage, in the middle of a winter emergency, and had been back in my garage since the moment power was restored. I had documentation of both the outage start and end times from the utility company's customer portal, with exact timestamps. I noted the second notice and added it to my file. Then, and this is where it started getting genuinely interesting, I started talking to my neighbors. Now, when you live in a neighborhood for 4 years, you know people. Not always deeply, but you know them. You know who is friendly and who keeps to themselves. You know who has had their own run-ins with Gail Fenwick. And it turned out that quite a few of my neighbors had stories. Gary Mossner had received a fine for parking his truck facing the wrong direction on his own driveway, which is not a real rule anywhere, but Gail had cited it anyway. The Hendersons on Maple Court had been fined for having a basketball hoop in their driveway that Gail claimed blocked pedestrian flow, despite the fact that their driveway was a solid 15 feet from the sidewalk, and there was no pedestrian flow anywhere near it. Tom Delacroix, 2 streets over, had gotten a letter about his garbage cans being visible from the street for more than 2 hours on collection day, which, given the way garbage collection actually works in winter when trucks are running late, was basically unavoidable. The pattern was clear. Gail was targeting certain homeowners with increasingly invented or wildly stretched interpretations of HOA rules. And she was doing it selectively, meaning that some homeowners never received notices for similar situations, while others seemed to be on some kind of list. I started wondering why. The answer came from an unexpected source. Pete Gallagher, the older gentleman 2 doors down who had charged his medical device on my generator during the outage, had lived in Creekside Pines since the neighborhood was built. He knew things. He remembered things. And one afternoon when I was clearing the fresh snow off my driveway after yet another overnight snowfall, he wandered over bundled up in his massive parka, moving carefully because of his wrist, and we got to talking. Pete told me that 3 years ago, before I had moved in, there had been a proposal to change the HOA management company. The current company, Prestige Community Management, handled the administrative work for Creekside Pines, and their contract was worth a significant amount of money annually. A competing firm had offered to do the same work for considerably less, which would have reduced HOA fees for homeowners. Gail Fenwick had personally blocked the proposal, citing vague concerns about transition disruption and service quality. The vote had been narrow, 3-2. What Pete also told me, very quietly, was that there had been a rumor for years that Gail Fenwick had some kind of personal connection to Prestige Community Management. Nothing proven, just whispers. I thanked Pete and went back inside my warm house, snow boots leaving tracks across my kitchen floor, and I sat down and started doing some research. It took me about an hour of public records searching online before I found something interesting. Prestige Community Management LLC was registered with the state. Its listed members were a man named Donald Harwick and a woman named Sandra Fenwick Harwick. Sandra Fenwick Harwick. I searched a bit more. Sandra Fenwick Harwick was Gail Fenwick's sister-in-law, married to Gail's brother. Gail Fenwick had been voting on the HOA management contract for years, casting votes that kept her sister-in-law's company in the management role, without ever disclosing that financial relationship to the community. That is not a petty neighborhood dispute. That is a conflict of interest. Depending on how the HOA's governing documents define fiduciary obligations, and depending on state law, it could be considerably worse than that. I sat with this for a couple of days. I wanted to be careful. I did not want to blow this up prematurely or without solid documentation, so I kept gathering information. I connected with a few more neighbors quietly. I found out that Gary Mossner had actually done some digging of his own at one point, because his fine had felt wrong to him too, but he had hit a wall and given up. The Hendersons were furious about their basketball hoop fine and had kept all their paperwork. Tom Delacroix had 3 separate notices in a drawer somewhere that he had never responded to because he had assumed it was pointless. I explained to each of them what I had found. Their reactions were satisfying. I also reached out to a friend of mine who happened to be a real estate attorney. Not to hire him formally, at least not yet, just to have a conversation. I explained the situation over the phone, and he listened carefully, and then said a few things that were very helpful. He confirmed that in our state, HOA board members are considered to have fiduciary duties to the community. Voting on contracts that financially benefit a family member without disclosing that relationship is a clear breach of fiduciary duty. Depending on the dollar amounts involved over the years and whether the HOA had suffered financial harm as a result, it could potentially rise to the level of civil fraud. And if she had personally enriched herself or her family through that arrangement, there were additional legal exposure points. He also confirmed what I had already read in the bylaws, that my generator refueling was not a violation, and that the notices I had received were procedurally improper because they were based on a misrepresentation of the bylaw language. Now I had a real hand to play. But timing mattered. The third week of February brought another brutal snowstorm. This one hit on a Wednesday and dropped nearly 18 inches overnight, which is the kind of snow that breaks snowblowers, throws out backs, and makes people genuinely question why they chose to live somewhere with actual winter. I was up at 5 in the morning, out in my driveway with my snowblower, because I had learned from experience that you want to get ahead of it before it compacts. The whole street was quiet except for the sound of wind and my snowblower, and a few houses down, Gary Mossner's snowblower starting up. Power stayed on this time, thankfully. But the roads were bad enough that by mid-morning, several people on our street were stuck. The plows had come through once, but the snow was falling faster than they could keep up, and the secondary residential streets like ours were clearly a low priority. Icy patches under fresh snow made the whole situation treacherous. I helped 3 of my neighbors dig out their cars. I scattered ice melt on Pete Gallagher's walkway because his wrist was still not great. The Hendersons' teenage son got his car hung up on the snowbank at the end of the driveway, and I helped push him out. It was that kind of morning where the neighborhood actually comes together, because winter is making everyone's life hard and cooperation is just the practical response. Gail Fenwick, I noticed, was not outside helping anyone. Her driveway had been plowed, which meant she had a service, but she was nowhere to be seen. She had not cleared the sidewalk in front of her property, which, interestingly, was actually a real HOA rule, not an invented one. All homeowners were required to clear the sidewalk adjacent to their property within 24 hours of a snowfall. I noted that and kept my mouth shut about it for the moment. 2 days after the storm, I got a third notice from Gail. This one claimed that during the snowstorm, I had created a snow pile at the end of my driveway that partially extended onto the common area strip between the sidewalk and the street, which she claimed was a violation of the property boundary rules. I checked my security camera footage. I had a camera at the front of my house that covered the driveway and the sidewalk area, installed about a year ago after someone had hit my mailbox in the middle of the night and driven off. The footage from the morning of the snowstorm clearly showed my snowblower operation, clearly showed where I was directing the snow, and clearly showed that at no point did my snow pile extend into any common area. It went onto my own front lawn, which was exactly where it was supposed to go. I also noted from the same footage that Gail Fenwick had driven past my house at approximately 8:15 that morning, slowed down, and appeared to be looking at my driveway. She had not stopped. She had just looked. I saved that clip. I now had 3 improper violation notices, documentary evidence that none of the alleged violations had actually occurred or applied to my situation, documented evidence of a potential conflict of interest involving financial self-dealing, a stack of similar experiences from multiple neighbors, and security camera footage supporting my position. The HOA annual meeting was scheduled for the first Saturday of March. That was 3 weeks away. I started preparing. I drafted a formal complaint against Gail Fenwick to be presented to the full board at the annual meeting. This was a document that laid out, clearly and with citations, every relevant fact. The misrepresentation of Section 14, subsection C, the improper issuance of violation notices. The conflict of interest involving Prestige Community Management and Sandra Fenwick Harwick. The pattern of selective enforcement across multiple homeowners. I cited the specific bylaw provisions governing board member conduct and fiduciary responsibility. I cited the relevant state statutes. I attached exhibits. I kept it professional and factual throughout. I shared it with Gary Mossner, the Hendersons, Tom Delacroix, and Pete Gallagher. They each reviewed it and added their own documented experiences as exhibits. Gary wrote a short summary of his parking direction fine. The Hendersons attached all their basketball hoop correspondence. Tom pulled his notices out of the drawer. Pete contributed a written statement about the management company vote from 3 years ago and what he had observed. I also, quietly, contacted a local news journalist who ran a community affairs blog that a lot of local residents followed. I did not ask her to run anything yet. I just made sure she was aware that something was developing and worth keeping an eye on. Then I went back to my attorney friend and asked him to actually review the full package. He agreed, and after going through it, he told me that the conflict of interest issue was genuinely serious. He estimated that if Prestige Community Management had been retained at above-market rates for multiple years due to Gail's influence, the financial damage to the HOA could be significant. He offered to attend the annual meeting as my representative if needed, and he drafted a formal demand letter to the HOA board as a whole, notifying them of the fiduciary duty breach and demanding that Gail Fenwick be recused from all future votes involving the management contract pending a formal investigation. I sent that letter to all 5 board members, certified mail, 1 week before the annual meeting. The response was immediate and not what Gail had probably hoped for. 2 of the 5 board members, people who were not part of Gail's inner circle, called me within 24 hours. One of them, a man named Howard Kreft who had been on the board for only about a year, was genuinely shocked by the management company connection. He had not known. The other, a woman named Patricia Lowell, was less surprised but clearly relieved that someone was finally putting it in writing. Both of them agreed to review the complaint package and consider how to handle it at the annual meeting. Gail, meanwhile, sent me what I can only describe as a threatening letter. Not physically threatening, but legally posturing. It accused me of harassment, of attempting to destabilize the community, and of making false allegations that could expose me to legal liability. It was signed by her personally, not by the board as a whole, which told me she was acting on her own rather than with board consensus. I forwarded that letter to my attorney, who noted with some amusement that it was almost certainly meant to intimidate me into backing down, and that it had no actual legal merit. He advised me to keep it as an exhibit and say nothing in response. The week before the annual meeting, the weather gave us one more parting shot. Another snowstorm, this one not as heavy as the February monster, but enough to make roads slippery and tempers short. I cleared my driveway and sidewalk promptly. I helped Pete with his again. On the 3rd day after the snow, I casually photographed the sidewalk in front of Gail Fenwick's house, which still had not been cleared of snow and ice. By my count, she was past the 24-hour window required by the actual, genuine HOA rule. I included that photo in my exhibit package, not out of spite, but because it was a perfect illustration of the selective enforcement pattern. She was happy to issue violations for things that were not violations, while not bothering to comply with real rules herself. The morning of the annual meeting arrived cold and clear, the sky that brilliant sharp blue you only get in late winter when every bit of humidity has been frozen out of the air. I drove to the community center, which was the small building the HOA rented annually for this purpose, and arrived to find the parking lot already surprisingly full. Word had gotten around. This was not going to be the usual 12 people in folding chairs kind of annual meeting. By the time the meeting started, there were easily 60 homeowners in that room, maybe more. People were standing along the walls. The community journalist was there with a notepad. My attorney was there in a good suit. Pete Gallagher was there in his parka with his written statement in a folder. The Hendersons were there. Gary Mossner was there with his arms crossed. Tom Delacroix was there, looking like a man who had been waiting for this for a while. Gail Fenwick walked in and looked around at the crowd, and I watched something shift in her expression. Just for a second, before she reassembled the pleasantness. She sat at the board table in her teal coat and opened her clipboard. The board chair, a man named Walter Briggs, who was largely a figurehead and not directly involved in any of this, called the meeting to order and ran through the opening procedural items. Budget review, committee reports. Then the floor opened for homeowner concerns. I stood up first. I kept my tone calm and professional throughout. I introduced myself for the record, gave my address, and then proceeded to present the complaint. I walked through the violation notices I had received, Section 14 subsection C, the actual language versus how it had been represented to me, the emergency exception clause, and the security camera footage showing the snowstorm situation. I explained that I had documented all of this carefully and provided the board with a full written package in advance. Then I got to the management company connection. I want to be honest, the room was very quiet during this part. Not uncomfortable quiet, more like the particular quiet of a group of people absorbing information that is genuinely new and significant to them. I explained the public records search, Sandra Fenwick Harwick, Prestige Community Management, the family connection. The fact that Gail Fenwick had cast votes on the management company contract multiple times without disclosing this relationship to the board or the community. I cited the relevant state statute by number. I cited the bylaw language on fiduciary duty. I said that our attorney had reviewed the matter and was present if the board had questions. I sat down. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Walter Briggs, the board chair, cleared his throat and looked at Gail Fenwick. "Gail, would you like to respond?" What followed was not one of Gail Fenwick's better moments. She started with denial, which was brisk and confident. The family connection was not relevant. Sandra was her brother's wife, not her direct family. There was no financial benefit to her personally. The management company provided excellent service. The violation notices she had issued were entirely proper and within her authority as board secretary. Then Howard Kreft, the newer board member, spoke up. He asked very carefully and precisely whether Gail had disclosed the family relationship to any other board member at any point during the contract renewal votes. Gail paused for just a half-second too long. Howard pressed the point. Had she or had she not disclosed it? She had not. The room murmured. Patricia Lowell asked whether the HOA's current management fees were competitive with market rates. Nobody in the room knew the exact answer to that off the top of their heads, but my attorney stood up at this point and noted that based on public information, Prestige Community Management's fees for Creekside Pines were approximately 18% above the regional average for comparable communities, and that over the 6 years of Gail's tenure, this represented an estimated excess cost to the Homeowners Association of somewhere in the range of $40,000 to $60,000. Depending on how you calculated comparable market rates. He was careful to say this was an estimate, not a final audit figure, but that a proper forensic audit would establish the precise number. $40,000 to $60,000. The room was not quiet after that. People started talking at once. Walter Briggs tried to maintain order. Gail Fenwick was very red in the face and was speaking rapidly about how the comparison was unfair and the services were not comparable, and she had always acted in the best interest of the community, but nobody was really listening to her anymore. Tom Delacroix stood up and talked about his garbage can notices. Gary Mossner talked about his parking direction fine. The Hendersons talked about the basketball hoop. 3 other homeowners I had not even spoken to beforehand stood up and described their own experiences with violation notices that seemed invented or wildly stretched. One woman said she had paid a fine 2 years ago for having holiday decorations up 2 days past the approved date because she had been in the hospital with her daughter and had come home to a fine notice. She had paid it because she had not known she could fight it. She was angry now. Righteously, reasonably angry. Gail Fenwick tried to address each of these in turn, but she was losing the room fast. And then the community journalist, who had been quietly taking notes the whole time, raised her hand and asked politely whether the board would be willing to comment on the record about the financial audit question. Walter Briggs, sweating slightly, said that the board would need to confer before making any formal statement on that. That was essentially the end of Gail Fenwick's control of the room. The meeting ran for almost 3 hours. By the end of it, the board had voted, 4-1, to commission an independent forensic audit of the HOA's finances and management contract history. The one dissenting vote was Gail's. They also voted to immediately pause any new violation notices pending a review of enforcement procedures. And they voted to form a compliance committee, to be made up of non-board homeowners, that would review all outstanding fines from the past 3 years. Howard Kreft moved that Gail Fenwick be recused from any votes relating to the management company or the audit process, and that motion passed unanimously, with Gail abstaining. She left the meeting early. Just stood up while people were still talking, collected her clipboard, put her coat on, and walked out. The door closed behind her, and I think at least half the room breathed a little easier. The forensic audit started in April. Spring was coming in by then, the snow finally giving up its grip on the neighborhood, dirty snowbanks along the streets shrinking down to nothing, and then disappearing. The audit took about 6 weeks and was conducted by an outside firm hired directly by the board without Gail's involvement. The results were not subtle. Over 6 years, the HOA had paid prestige community management fees that exceeded market comparables by approximately $53,000. The audit also identified a one-time payment made 3 years earlier, described in the records as a consulting fee, paid directly from HOA funds to Prestige for what was vaguely described as community standards enhancement services. That payment had no board authorization on record. It had been processed by Gail Fenwick in her capacity as board secretary. That was not a conflict of interest anymore. That was financial fraud. The unauthorized disbursement of HOA funds by a board officer for services with no documentation, no authorization, and a direct benefit to a family member's company. My attorney helped the board file a formal complaint with the county district attorney's office. I want to say I felt triumphant when that happened, but honestly what I felt was more tired than anything else. The kind of tired you feel when something has been going on too long, and you are relieved it is finally moving toward resolution. The DA's office investigated. In early June, Gail Fenwick was charged with 1 count of breach of fiduciary duty and 1 count of fraudulent misappropriation of organizational funds. Both were felony charges under our state's laws governing nonprofit organizations, because HOAs in our state are incorporated as nonprofits. She was arrested on a Tuesday morning. A neighbor texted me about it, having seen the sheriff's vehicle parked in front of her house. I did not go outside to watch. That felt unnecessary and frankly a little mean. I had done what I needed to do. The rest was up to the justice system. The case eventually resolved through a plea agreement. Gail Fenwick pleaded guilty to 1 count of fraudulent misappropriation. The other charge was reduced to a misdemeanor, and she was sentenced to 2 years of probation, ordered to pay restitution to the HOA in the amount of $38,000, the agreed-upon figure negotiated as part of the plea, and banned from serving on any nonprofit board for 5 years under the terms of the agreement. She resigned from the HOA board the same day she entered her plea. Prestige Community Management's contract was terminated. The HOA went through a proper competitive bidding process and selected a new management company at a rate that was, according to the board's communication to homeowners, 17% lower annually than what they had been paying. That translated to a reduction in monthly HOA dues that every homeowner in Creekside Pines received the following year. The Compliance Committee reviewed all outstanding fines and violation notices from the past 3 years. They found that approximately 40% of the notices reviewed had either been issued based on misrepresented bylaw language, lacked adequate documentation, or involved situations where the applicable rule had a clear exception that the issuing board member had not applied. Those fines and notices were rescinded. The woman who had paid a fine while her daughter was in the hospital received a full refund with a written apology from the board. Gary Mossner's parking direction fine was rescinded and refunded. The Hendersons' basketball hoop notices were voided. Tom Delacroix's garbage can notices were thrown out entirely. And my 3 violation notices, the generator refueling notice, the improper storage notice, and the snow pile notice, were all officially rescinded. The board sent me a written acknowledgement that my use of the generator and my handling of the snowstorm situation had been fully in compliance with the HOA governing documents. I printed that acknowledgement and filed it in the same folder as the original violation notices, mostly because I am the kind of person who keeps things in order. Neatly labeled, full documentation. The annual meeting the following year was a very different event, small, efficient, friendly. New management company representative presented the budget clearly and answered questions without drama. Howard Kreft was elected board chair. Patricia Lowell took on the secretary role. A few new homeowners ran for the open board seats and won. People who just genuinely wanted to serve the community rather than use the position for personal benefit. The whole thing was over in an hour and 15 minutes, and ended with people standing around eating the cookies somebody had brought and talking about the new proposal for a community walking path along the creek. Pete Gallagher found me near the cookie table and shook my hand, which was something of a production given his wrist, which had finally fully healed. He said he had lived in Creekside Pines for 22 years, and that the last year had been the most dramatic, but also the most satisfying he could remember in terms of community governance. He was not wrong. Gary Mossner clapped me on the shoulder and said I should have run for the board myself, and I told him absolutely not. I had a job and a life and no interest in spending my evenings reading management contracts. He laughed at that. The Henderson's son actually came by my house the following weekend to help me clean up my backyard, entirely unprompted, just as a thank you. He was a good kid. We raked out the dead leaves that had been matted down under the snow all winter and talked about cars and college applications, and I felt oddly cheerful about the whole thing. The generator, which started all of this, was still sitting in my garage where it belonged. A good machine, well maintained. Properly stored with stabilizer in the fuel container stored safely, everything by the book. I had not needed to use it since that January outage, which was fine. That is the nature of a backup system. You take care of it so it is there when you need it. Winter came around again the following year, as it always does in this part of the world, and we had our first significant snowfall in early December. I was out in the driveway with my snowblower in the early morning, the cold, clean air in my lungs, the neighborhood quiet except for the scraping of shovels and the occasional distant plow. Gary was out on his driveway. The Hendersons' kid was helping his dad with their walk. Pete Gallagher's sidewalk had already been cleared by a teenager from down the street who apparently did it voluntarily every time it snowed now, just because Pete was old and his wrist was never going to be totally right again. It was a neighborhood working the way a neighborhood is supposed to work. People helping each other, following reasonable rules that existed for reasonable purposes, with no one person abusing a position of trust for personal gain. I finished my driveway, looked up at the gray December sky, watched the first new flakes starting to come down fat and slow, and thought that if it came to it, if the power went out again and I needed that generator, I would refuel it in my driveway without a second thought. Because I was well within my rights, I had the documentation to prove it, and I had learned the hard way that the most important thing you can do when someone in a position of petty authority tries to push you around with invented rules is know your rights better than they know the rules they are pretending to enforce. That, and keep your security camera footage. You never know when you are going to need it. The snow kept coming down, dusting the bare trees along the street, settling onto the rooftops, making the whole neighborhood look like something off a holiday card. I put the snowblower away, kicked the ice off my boots at the door, and went inside to make coffee. The house was warm. The generator was in the garage. The documentation was in its folder. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be.